In 1997, Chris McKinstry produced CR6, the first interactive soap opera of its kind on the internet. Despite the hype surrounding this series, it quickly faded into obscurity after around 9 episodes had been released. It had been more or less forgotten for years until a Reddit user stumbled across a record of it by chance, subsequently leading to a surprisingly dark rabbit hole involving death, mystery, and conspiracies. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to gain access to uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. This video will discuss topics that some might find triggering, including death, murder, suicide, and abuse. Viewer discretion is advised. Please do not attempt to contact anyone mentioned in this video, or anyone else you come across that may be involved. Chris McKinstry was an early internet software developer and engineer. Despite many controversies throughout his life, he could be considered a pioneer of artificial intelligence, and while he certainly made many enemies throughout his career, by many accounts he was a genius. There isn't a huge amount of information online about him, which really isn't that surprising considering he was an internet user in the 1990s. By the end of that decade, still only around 37% of adults in the UK use the internet at home or at work, and that was after a relatively recent boom. The figures were much less in the US, with only around 20% using the internet in 1999. Ivo Phillips, who ran an online financial services company, said to the BBC, "The internet did not so much come of age as come of youth in 1999. With this in mind, it kind of makes sense that Chris has mostly been forgotten, and as you'll soon come to see, it's a little hard to separate fact from fiction with what remains. Chris claimed that at the age of 17, he became a millionaire by inventing an anti-copy protection code that he licensed out for various high-profile companies. A newspaper article featured on his website from April 1994 seemingly confirms that he did develop and sell the program, and the headline states that it could earn him millions, but it's doubtful whether he actually did earn millions from it. Chris had a long history of mental health problems, and in 1990, when he was 23 years old, he was in a 7.5-hour standoff with police in Toronto. He had entered a gun shop, grabbed a handgun from the shop owner, then hidden in the basement with 2 armed rifles. During the negotiations, he'd told police that he'd had problems with his girlfriend and was contemplating taking his own life. At one point, he disappeared from the view of the police, so they sprayed the shop with tear gas and went down to the basement to get him. Chris was conscious and uninjured and was taken to the hospital after. Sometime after this incident, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He spent the next few years pursuing a psychology degree and developing AI technology that later led him to become the lead developer of MindPixel, a web-based collaborative AI project that ran from 2000 to 2005. Anyway, in 1997, Chris had decided to try something a little different. The internet was still in its early days in the public domain. Now was the perfect time for innovation. The first radio soap opera was way back in 1930, titled Painted Dreams, and sponsored by soap manufacturers, hence the name soap opera. Years later, soaps would begin airing on television, and by the early 1950s, they were a fixture of daytime TV. Their popularity continued to grow over the years, and having already spread from radio to television, it wasn't a bad idea to introduce the concept to the internet. Chris came up with the idea of clickable reality 6 that he described as, quote, "An internet-based soap opera, for lack of a better term, is actually darker than a soap opera." CR6 wasn't the first ever soap on the internet, but at this point they were very basic. Almost all were based on diaries. You would click a character and read their diary entry. They didn't have much of a plot, and there wasn't much content to accompany the entries, and Chris felt that he could create something much better. He said in a 1997 promotional video, "Our story is deep, very deep. It's mystic. It will hold people for decades." Almost 3 decades later, we can safely say that Chris was wrong. All that seems to remain now is a few scattered details in all but forgotten corners of the internet, and the show itself is long lost. It likely would have remained buried if it weren't for a Reddit user who came across a record of it by chance in 2021. The user made a post on the Lost Media subreddit after going down a seemingly pointless rabbit hole related to an episode of Better Call Saul. He ended up on the Wikipedia page for an actor who had played an Air Force captain, Brendan Fair, and noticed in one of the edits from 2006 that he had been cast in an early internet soap opera, CR6. Intrigued to find out more, he began researching, but there was a surprising lack of information on it. OP wrote in the Reddit post, quote, "In 1996, Chris created and produced the internet soap opera CR6, a venture which supposedly lost over $1 million and caused him to burn almost every bridge he had left in Canada and America. From all accounts, production was a disaster, with almost every single person who worked on the project alleging that they were never paid for their work. He eventually fled to Chile, which was where he would inevitably live most of his remaining days. Details are scarce on CR6 and are nearly impossible to come by online. We don't know the cast, the amount of episodes, how far it got into production, or even the plot. All we know is that it happened, it cost $1 million, and caused the creator, Chris McKinstry, to live life in self-exile in Chile. A lot of the information we do have on the show actually comes from McKinstry himself, who would reveal details only to debunk what he saw as slanders to his name. McKinstry claims that he was the only one who lost money, and when production was over and the website was a complete bust, he sold the rights to distribution and ownership of the show to the cast for $1. For a while now, this was where the mystery stood. An online soap opera, now lost, with literally nothing known about it. Although this post didn't garner a huge amount of attention, it certainly drew in a handful of people who were now far too invested to let it lie. As the Redditor stated, Chris claimed to have sold the rights to the cast, so perhaps if the cast could be found, so could the show. OP had found out about CR6 in the first place through Brendan Fair's Wikipedia page, so one member of the cast had already been identified, but who were the rest? Shortly after OP made this post, another user commented with a link to the original CR6 website, which now redirects to a Chinese domain hosting site, but there is an archive of the homepage on the Wayback Machine. The page is basically a shell. There are only a few lines of text, none of the images load, and the other pages, including episodes, cast and credits, weren't archived at the time, but there are a few useful pieces of information nonetheless. The text that appears where one of the images should be reads, "Welcome to CR6, the first clickable reality. Episode 8 is currently online. Click to enter." This indicates that at least 8 episodes were published on the site, and the first clickable reality seems to imply that either Chris planned to make more clickable reality shows in the future, or he had anticipated this concept would take off and other shows would be created by other people inspired by CR6. Below the images was a line stating, "As seen on CNN midday." And then 2 brief reviews, the first from Uptown, quote, "Everyone looks great, quite watchable." The other was by Yahoo Canada. While the technology side of this site rates high on the gee-whiz scale, the characters are what will keep you coming back for more every week. These are noteworthy because they show that at one point, CR6 had generated some publicity. It wasn't some totally unheard of project that never stood a chance, and those who had seen it had positive reactions, which makes you wonder why it never did properly take off, and instead very quickly faded into obscurity. A couple of days after the discovery of the CR6 website, another Redditor found the promotional video for the show, which I mentioned earlier. It had been uploaded on YouTube in July 2011 by a user named Rivalry, who has 19 other videos on his channel, most of which are music related and nothing to do with CR6 or Chris. The video almost seems a little out of place. The only connection being some of the other videos are about Winnipeg, where Chris was from, including a Winnipeg club crawl, suggesting the uploader might have also lived in Winnipeg. They might have uploaded the CR6 video simply because it was relevant to Winnipeg, and/or because they remembered watching the show at the time, or maybe they even knew Chris personally. Even if the person who uploaded this video on YouTube didn't know Chris personally, it's certainly possible that they had some information that is no longer publicly available now, and that could be useful in the search for CR6. The description reads, "Promotional video for CR6. This clickable reality ran for about 6 months in 1997. Unfortunately, the channel hasn't uploaded in over 10 years, there isn't an email address or any links, and searching the username doesn't bring up any accounts on any other social media of any users with that same name. When the CR6 video was found by the Redditor, it only had 250 views and 3 comments, and the uploader hasn't replied to any of the recent comments, so there doesn't appear to be any way to contact them. The video itself does provide some useful information though. It was commissioned by Chris, produced by a now defunct company called Brown Commissions, and showed Chris vaguely describing the concept of CR6, a few behind the scenes shots, the CR6 website when it was still functioning, and a phone number which, unsurprisingly, is no longer active. More importantly, it featured the director, Brendan Sawatsky, and the names of the actors who played the 6 main characters. There was Anita Dittmar, Carly Benoit, Karen Markham, Carlo Galante, Jeff Grays, and Robert Ryder. The mention of Anita Dittmar led sleuths to find a blog she started in 2012 that briefly mentioned her work with CR6. She wrote, "In 1996 or 97, I think, I was cast in a crazy internet soap opera called CR6 by Chris McKinstry, a guy you kind of had to meet to truly believe. I was totally typecast as an alcoholic former model and it didn't last very long, but it was a cool way to spend a couple of months. It all happened before I had internet access or even an email address, so I really wish that I had archived some of the pictures. I do have some VHS tapes from the media kit that shows a clip of us on CNN and footage of me coming out of a limo and signing autographs. See, I'm kind of a big deal. I saved a newspaper clipping, even though they spelled my last name wrong, but the picture is all me, baby." Anita shared a photo of the newspaper clipping that she had stuck in a notebook. It read, "Net soap opera role suits student." Being a soap opera star was never something Anita Dittmar dreamed of becoming, but that could change if CR6 is a success. Dittmar plays former model Anna Frobisher, one of 6 main characters in the locally produced internet soap opera which began shooting its first episodes this week. "I think everyone wants to be an actor when they're a kid, but it was never anything I pursued," said Dittmar, a human ecology major at the University of Manitoba. Dittmar said she was at a bar when she was approached by producers who asked her to audition for the weekly soap. "Everyone's been great, and they've been good to me time-wise with my school," she said. Ditmar said she can't reveal anything about her character, so people will have to wait until CR6 debuts on February the 14th. Christopher McKinstry, president of Clickable Systems International Limited, the show's producer, said the viewers of the soap will determine how big a role Ditmar's character will have on the program. We can get instant feedback on what people want by monitoring the number of clicks a character is getting, explained McKinstry. We can bring up characters people are more interested in. Viewers of the site will be able to click onto the characters to find out more about them and to follow their storyline. Creative director Brendan Sawatsky said that's one of the advantages over a TV soap. If you miss the first few episodes, you can click back to the beginning, or if there is a murder weapon, you can click on it to get more information, he said. McKinstry said that while CR6 will begin as a series of still photographs, he plans to have real-time video in 2 years. In the meantime, the company is also working on a CD-ROM version of the show. Chris's website, which is still live now, but hasn't been updated in many years, provides a decent amount of further information on CR6. On the page titled Press, there is a section featuring the newspaper article about the anti-theft software he created that, according to the article, could earn him millions, and according to Chris, allowed him to retire in comfort 13 years later. The rest of the page is about CR6. He mentions the CNN piece, quote, "I even made it to CNN on January the 8th, 1997, with a 3-minute piece that ran all day that day on my now quite dead internet soap opera, CR6. Then there is a newspaper article that was on the front page of the Winnipeg Free Press on the 15th of February, 1997. It read, "The internet has a lot of growing up to do," says the Winnipeg creator of Canada's first interactive soap opera. "Right now, all you hear about the internet is porn," Chris McKinstry said yesterday. "It is a child going through a phase where it is fascinated with feces and genitalia, but it will grow up." McKinstry believes CR6, an interactive soap developed here by his Winnipeg company, Clickable Systems International, will help the net both clean up and grow up. The soap was to have been launched on the net last night at 11 p.m. at the Pyramid Cabaret. CR6 stars a Winnipeg cast of 6 main characters. It can be accessed at www.cr6.com. New episodes will be added weekly. At first, the show will feature 16 to 18 still photographs with written text and dozens of objects that viewers can click on for further information. McKinstry, speaking at a press conference at the Manitoba Legislative Building yesterday, said interactive shows such as CR6 are a democratic form of entertainment. Viewers can ignore elements of the show that don't interest them and learn more about elements that do. As well, producers can gauge which parts of the show viewers are responding to and can then increase the time given to popular situations. "The whole planet wants to be entertained in an interactive format," McKinstry, 30, said. "It's about control instead of being controlled." The first episode of CR6 takes place in a fictional town of Mesmer's Cove, where the 6 main characters meet at a funeral. Apparently CR6 was a Yahoo pick of the week, and Chris included the full review, only the last sentence of which had featured on the CR6 website. Quote, "CR6 is the creation of Clickable Systems International, a Winnipeg company redefining the limits of the internet. Imagine a storybook where, as you progress through the pages, you can choose different characters to hear their thoughts or follow them down private pathways, or, again, we shouldn't be telling. But while the technology side of this site rates high on the gee-whiz scale, the characters are what will keep you coming back for more every week." There are also a few sporadic details on the Winnipeg General Google group about CR6. Chris posted in thousands of threads and created many himself. I spent a full day just scrolling through these to find information on CR6 and Chris himself, which we'll get into more later in the video. But here's a list, in no particular order, of some of the things I found on CR6. In addition to coverage on CNN, Chris claimed that the following had all done or were planning to do stories on CR6. CBC National, Venture, CTV, MTN, YTV. Chris claimed that each episode had a budget of around $50,000. There was going to be a live video Halloween episode that had a budget of $120,000. The plan was to sell it on CD-ROM, and that was a $500,000 project. Chris was apparently in talks with a very well-known production company to do a film version of CR6. The CR6 launch party was on the 14th of February at the Pyramid Cabaret in Winnipeg from 8 p.m. till 2 a.m. Tickets were $2, and those attended were asked to bring a non-perishable food item for the Winnipeg Harvest. A portion of the proceeds were donated to the Harvest and Amnesty International. There were spelling errors in the character bios on the CR6 site. Chris often made spelling errors himself when posting in Google groups, so he likely wrote the bios himself and didn't have them checked over by anyone else. Chris vaguely mentions some of the later episodes including bondage and heroin, and on the 6th of March said CR6 is about to get, quote, very weird. If you like the X-Files, you'll like CR6. With the information on Chris's website, Anita's blog, the Google groups, and the promotional video, we have a pretty good idea of the concept of CR6, and some other articles that have been found since provide some details on the characters and the plot. The Lost Media Wiki has a good summary of the characters. Michelle Paddington, played by Carly Michelle Benoit, was a businesswoman and temptress extraordinaire. Always hatching a new scheme, she's not above stepping on some toes in her scramble to the top. Anna Frobisher, played by Anita Dittmar, was an alcoholic former model, a sophisticated woman who takes a backseat to no one. Alberto Ashland, played by Carlo Galante, was a lover of women, style and mystery. So far, his smooth talking isn't going over well with the ladies. Wayne Donaldson, played by former professional football player Jeff Grays, was a lawyer who hasn't got much to hide, just a big lug of a guy whose heart is as big as his muscles. Elizabeth Sands, played by Karen Markham, was a devil-may-care, freewheeling artist. And finally, Victor Larson, played by Robert Ryder, was, quote, perhaps the strangest of all, a man with a shady past. He's also got a passion for mind games. As for the premise, the show started with the 6 main characters meeting for the first time at the funeral of a dead man who none of them remember. When CR6 was cancelled, there was an article in the Winnipeg Free Press stating that a total of 9 episodes had been posted and 3 more had been written but never got produced. According to a comment on the Lost Media Wiki, Episode 13 was going to include Anna and Michelle having an affair, Wayne appearing to shoot himself and having a near-death experience, Alberto going to a gay bar, and Lily having a drug experience. I'm guessing Lily was a side character that was introduced later on. It'd be fair to say that CR6 was a seemingly well-thought-out show with an innovative concept. It had plenty of media attention, a couple of good reviews from well-known sources, and the CR6 website was generating hundreds of thousands of views. So what the hell happened? How did this supposedly revolutionary show become so quickly abandoned and forgotten? What is known is that the show turned out to be a disaster and apparently resulted in Chris losing over $1 million and being hated by most of the crew that worked on CR6. On his website, he wrote a couple of vague sentences on why CR6 came to an end. Quote, "The whole thing came apart the way many music groups do, in fighting. It finally got so bad that I withdrew from the project, selling the rights to all the intellectual property to the cast. they did none of the fighting. In an interview with Chris, posted by someone who called themselves Ansel Morgan, though some suspected it was actually Chris himself, he went into a bit more detail and blamed the creative production crew. Quote, "Why does the story in CR6 stink so much? Because we have a bunch of amateur writers with no balls. I'm really angry about the whole creative production side of CR6. So why don't you just fire them? I wish I could. God, I wish I could. But a few weeks prior to our launch, February 14th, 1997, the whole creative team pulled a coup on me. Basically, they formed their own company and held back the script until it was too late for me to get someone else to write it, then extorted me into signing a 3-month deal. It was a scene from hell. We were in a large conference room late at night, with them and their lawyers on one side of the table and us and ours on the other. It was a real mess. I really hated it, but I had no choice but to sign the letter of intent that night, or we would miss our launch and the project would die." Of course, we now know that it didn't take long for the project to die anyway, and it sounds like it was doomed from the start. This wasn't supposed to be the end for CR6 though. At the time Chris did this interview, the 3-month contract was almost up and he planned to write episodes 13, 14 and 15 himself, then hire one writer per episode after that, so he could monitor their progress easier. After the initial mess, he still had hope that CR6 would continue, so I have no idea what happened after this, whether there were more problems, or he just gave up. It seems that Chris had come up with a potentially revolutionary idea, but in reality had no idea how to pull it off. While the reviews from the likes of Yahoo Canada were positive, it seems that the public weren't so impressed. On the Winnipeg General Google group, various people criticised CR6 and Chris himself, often referring to CR6 as CR sucks or crap 6. One person defended him a little, stating, quote, "I've been browsing all the CR6 related posts and I'm just amazed at the number of flames CR6 and mckinstry is getting, especially all the personal attacks. The tech criticism is valid though. I've seen the site. Sure, it's not perfect, but for something put together within 2 months is not bad. A few wrinkles to iron out. Which is where some of the posts can actually help to improve the product. Give it time." Another person responded with, "McKinstry is a psychotic egomaniac who seems to take great enjoyment in inviting this type of behaviour towards himself. Reminds me of a dog that does stuff just to get into trouble. It thinks bad attention is better than no attention. Give it time. We're not the ones who said we spend millions of dollars and months developing that piece of slop. This isn't supposed to be some kind of thing started in his basement by a couple of beer buddies. It's supposed to be a professional, viable business. Besides, a number of us have made constructive comments about the horrible navigation of the site, and McKinstry responds, 'Get used to it, the interface is staying.' Doesn't give a damn what internet veterans think about his interface. Doesn't say, 'Yes, I agree, we are working on improving navigation.' Nope, it's his way or the highway. And the customer of his product be damned. McKinstry knows best. He's not trying too hard if he won't listen to people who have been around the internet in a while that his interface sucks and it should be redesigned. Considering all the money he supposedly spent, you think he would have done trials with people other than his staff and cast to ensure that people could navigate their way through that mess. Just another example of how he claims to be so terribly important but is doing things half-assed. 1. CR sucks isn't interesting, and 2. CR sucks isn't new." A man called Norman, who was one of Chris's notable enemies in the Winnipeg General Google group, posted a couple of days after the first episode was released, quote, "You know, I have to be honest here and say that I really did expect to see something impressive. I mean, let's face it, He's hired a number of attractive people, not that you can really tell given the quality of the graphics. He's hired a number of ostensibly talented graphic and video and film artists and technicians, and he actually sounded marginally capable in some of his interviews. But the amateurish interface layout, poor quality graphics, insipid dialogue, and even more pathetic plot, or lack thereof, was clearly a disappointment. It'd be over before they cleaned the floor at the opening party. Norman was pretty much right, and it's hardly surprising, considering Chris was a software developer with a particular interest in artificial intelligence. While parallels can be drawn between these things and the concept of CR6, and you still would expect the interface to have been better from someone with Chris's skills, it still seems a little odd they went from developing anti-theft software to producing a soap opera. Perhaps there was a little more to this decision than initially met the eye. In March 1997, a couple of weeks after the first episode of CR6 had been released, Chris made a post on a news group called Alt Consciousness, quote, "I know I'm always bugging people here to help me in weird projects, but you see, I've been, well, producing an internet soap opera for a while. Honestly, I did it just to attract more people to the Mystic project. It worked. Now I've got a problem and I need a little help from my friends here. Please vote for CR6 at Yahoo. In a roundabout way, it will help AI." Later that day, Chris posted in another news group, quote, "Every once in a while I return to my hex score and come back here and ask for some help. I need people to help with the AI project in my SIG. To up the volume on my server, I created a web-based soap opera at cr6.com. Check it out. We've got some babes, of both sexes. Please help vote us the Yahoo Canada Pick of the Week. It will help advance the state of the art and maybe help make computer conscious." It's worth noting that CR6 was also a nominee of the Yahoo Canada Reader's Choice, and according to discussions on the Winnipeg General Group from 1997, that particular vote led to Yahoo discontinuing the Reader's Choice. Chris blamed an unnamed person from the Winnipeg group who had allegedly voted numerous times against CR6, but others claimed that it was unlikely due to one person voting numerous times. If it was, it probably would have been Chris, but that it was more likely due to all the drama Chris stirred up over the whole thing. Either way, CR6 had just 2.8% of the votes, putting it in last place, even after Chris tried to trick people into voting for it by posting a link and saying, "Click here," without mentioning that the link led directly to a vote for CR6. Anyway, in the news group, Chris admitted that he only created CR6 in the first place to attract people to his AI project, which isn't the worst idea, if a little unusual. But was he even being honest here? Or was he desperately trying to save CR6 by appealing to a different audience, not wanting to admit defeat? It would transpire that although CR6 had attracted a decent amount of attention in the time running up to its release, it really wasn't as popular as Chris tried to make out after the episodes were posted. Chris claimed the site had over 600,000 hits in the first 2 weeks, and CR6 reps stated a much higher number of 500,000 in the first weekend during an interview on CJOB Radio. Already, these figures are inconsistent. How likely is it that the site would receive 500,000 hits in the first weekend, then only another 100,000 in the next few weeks after that? The actual figure is thought to be around 123,000 hits in the first 2 weeks, but this number doesn't mean that 123,000 individual people visited the site. As an article on grub.net explained, quote, "The above 2 pages contain total hits to the site, not total initial hits from individual IP addresses. Every graphic sent, every link to mail, every page adds 1 hit to the count. It's easy to see how graphics-intense pages like CR6's can rack up large amounts of hits in no time. As for the ad revenue that would have been generated from these hits, that's a topic of much contention also. Chris claimed that advertisers were paying 0.6 cents per hit, which even if we use Chris's claims of 600,000 hits in the first 2 weeks, would work out at around $36,000 revenue in the first 2 weeks. Considering Chris claimed the budget for each episode was $50,000, so they'd have spent $100,000 in the first 2 weeks, it was losing money from the off. Of course, it's possible that CR6 would have gained popularity as time went on, but it did gain a lot of media attention in the first place, so the initial loss is quite significant. Anyway, in reality, the show likely made considerably less than $36,000 in the first few weeks. Each episode apparently had around 10 scenes, but there were only ads on around half of them. According to people on the Google group, the ads were placed in an out-of-the-way place. To do a very rough calculation, let's go with the figure of 123,000 hits in the first 2 weeks. Divide that by 6 because there were 6 characters, and most people who visited the site would probably at least click on each individual character. Half that because there were only ads on half of the 10 scenes, and you get an ad revenue of around $615 in the first 2 weeks, give or take. It could have been even less. One person said 2 weeks after CR6 was launched, they'd visited the site twice, gone through the entire plot available at the time, and not seen a single ad. An article in the Winnipeg Free Press in August 1997 implied that CR6 was struggling to find advertisers. Quote, "Nobody is going to buy ads if they don't know who their audience is." In general, Chris had a reputation for exaggerating just about everything. Anything to convince people his projects were going better than they were, whatever would make him sound more intelligent or successful. For example, he claimed to have read and annotated 6,500 books, which, at the time he made the claim, would have meant that he'd have read and annotated one book about every 2 days, starting from the second he was born. Back to CR6. Prior to the auditions for the cast, he was quoted in multiple newspapers as saying they were expecting over 2,300 people to show up. The actual number is thought to be around 700, and realistically, Chris probably didn't even expect this many people, as it sounds like the auditions were held in a hotel car park. An article written 2 days after the launch of CR6 stated, "They even popped up on CNN that evening." So it sounds like there was a brief reporting one time in the evening. It doesn't exactly support Chris's claims that the CNN segment ran all day. Multiple people have commented on Chris's ability to generate hype. It seems like that was one of his main talents, but behind the smokescreen, there was mostly just disappointment. The Winnipeg Free Press article referenced a minute ago stated, quote, "CR6 webisodic was going to make Winnipeg a showbiz capital." Chris had almost managed to convince people that CR6 would make Winnipeg the next Hollywood. People worked for free, trusting that he would pay them after, which he reportedly never did, and in the end, the whole thing flopped. He had announced his plans to make CR6 a motion picture within 2 years, but it seems that even if it hadn't been cancelled so soon after its release due to problems with the crew, it likely wouldn't have been popular enough to make it worth continuing for 2 years, and I fail to see how he didn't realise that. Did Chris ever really plan to take it so far though? Or was all this talk just an attempt to hype up the project and gain publicity for something he was never really that interested in the first place? Was it all just a scam? As I mentioned earlier, Chris claims that CR6 lost him over $1 million, but that he was the only person who lost money. Unless he really was telling the truth about becoming a millionaire thanks to the anti-theft software he created, where would he have even got such a large sum of money to throw at a project that wasn't even his main passion? There was some talk on Google groups that he received some money from the government to put towards production, but I have no idea how much, and Chris himself refuted these claims. Chris's claim that he was the only one who lost money is highly questionable anyway, as others who worked on the show claimed that they were never paid for their work, including photographers and drivers. The hotel used for shooting was also apparently never compensated. In an August 1997 issue of the Winnipeg Free Press, Brendan Sawatsky, the director who was in the promotional video, claimed that he was owed $70,000. I assume the actors were paid, as he clarified that they were not a problem during production, and Anita clearly had a good opinion of him as she spoke fondly of him on her blog. At some point after the Reddit post, a Discord server was created, dedicated to searching for CR6. They tracked down a few people who were involved in the production and ended up in quite a surprising and concerning situation, but we'll get onto that later. One of the people was Ian McCausland, who said that he had first met Chris in high school when CBC came to visit him about his programming software. He worked as the main photographer for CR6 and recalled a huge launch party with a limo driver that transported them. He also said that Chris was great at generating hype. Ian made a post on Facebook asking anyone else who had been involved to come forward, and a couple of people did. One woman said, quote, "Chris conned me into being a co-executive producer instead of taking part as an actor. I worked with him at his house until it became frightening." I have no idea what she means by "until it became frightening." I did message her on Facebook but haven't heard back. For this reason, I chose not to reveal her name here, as I'm guessing she wants no part of this now, so if you do come across her, please don't attempt to contact her. I'm sorry to say that this is more or less where the search ends. I've included pretty much everything I could find about CR6, and to this day, the show itself remains lost media. But there's still a lot more to this story, and here's where things start getting dark. After creating and discontinuing CR6 without paying most of the people involved in the production, Chris fled to Santiago, Chile, with estimated debts in excess of $100,000, according to Wikipedia. His debts were probably significantly more than $100,000, considering he reportedly neglected to pay just about everyone, presumably apart from the cast. After this, Chris spent much of his time focusing on AI projects and started the MindPixel project in July 2000. He had already launched the Mystic project in May 1996, which he would later claim was the motivation behind CR6. In very basic terms, Mystic was an AI program that aimed to create a knowledge base of millions of human-validated true or false statements, or probabilistic propositions. As I understand it, MindPixel was fundamentally the same thing, but perhaps an attempt at a more advanced version of Mystic. Throughout this time, Chris maintained his online presence on the Winnipeg General Group and elsewhere, and he continued to be a controversial figure. To put it bluntly, he was an annoyance, a nuisance. He would deliberately provoke people, then play the victim when they snapped back at him. He even reported a couple of people to the police for threats they made against him. I'm definitely not condoning threats of any kind, and if Chris was genuinely scared, I can't blame him for reporting them, but they certainly seem to me like empty threats, and I can't help but wonder if his only motivation for contacting the police was just to one-up people. He came across as narcissistic, always bragging about his accomplishments, some of which were questionable, bragging about buying new cars and having more money than the rest of the community. It's not clear whether or not he actually was significantly wealthy, especially after the failure of CR6, and the considerable amount of money he claimed to have lost as a result. All that said, many people were arguably too harsh to Chris, to the point where it verged on bullying. Everyone knew about the incident where he'd taken 2 guns hidden in the basement of the gun shop and told police he was going to take his own life. They knew he had suffered significantly with his mental health, and they'd mock him for it. Overall, Chris was a very complex person. He wasn't all good, but he wasn't all bad. By many accounts, he scammed various people with CR6, and there are a number of other things he could be criticised for. But I can't help but wonder if he had become a product of his environment and his mental illness. I read in an article about him that said when he was 4 years old, he asked his mother to sew a sleeping bag for his toy robot so it wouldn't get cold, insisting that robots have feelings. Obviously, he was very young at this time, but he clearly had empathy. He was just an innocent child who hadn't yet been exposed to the harsh realities of life. Just a few days before the gun shop incident, he had tried to institutionalize himself and was presumably refused the help he needed. It seems that the system failed him, and if it hadn't, perhaps things would have turned out differently. On the 20th of January 2006, Chris made the following post on a forum and also on his personal blog, quote, "So what does a web suicide note look like? Exactly like this. Whereas a prolonged life is not necessarily better, a prolonged death is necessarily worse. Seneca. My death at least will be quick. My mother told me once, late into my teens, when I was in intensive care after an intentional drug OD, that my child psychiatrist told her I would always be at risk of suicide, and that I would have to be watched closely. He was right. Suicide is a near constant theme in my mind. And this weekend, I am alone, and the voice is louder than it has ever been, so I am certain I will not survive the afternoon. I've already taken enough drugs that my liver will shut down shortly, and I'm off to find a place to hide and die. I am tired. I'm tired of feeling the same feelings and experiencing the same experiences. It's time to move on and see what is next, if anything. Enough is enough. Oh, and by the way, the mind is a maximum hypersurface and thought a trajectory on it, and the amygdala and hippocampus are hop maps of it. No one knew this before me, and it seems no one cares. So be it. My time will come in 100 or 1,000 years when the idea again returns. This Louis Vuitton, Prada, Mont Blanc is not for me. If only I was loved as much as a pen. A few people didn't believe he was serious and that it was just attention seeking. Some even mocked him, while others tried to talk him out of it, and went to quite some lengths to attempt to locate him and alert Chilean authorities about the situation. He did leave a few more comments after this, until one that read, "I OD'd in 1997 and spent weeks in intensive care on vitamin K because my blood would not clot, and I did severe liver damage, which is why I do not drink now, if you must know. I'm feeling really impaired, and yes, time will tell what happens to me. I really have to get out of here. I cannot type and want to vomit. Time to go hide." Chris was never heard from again. On the 24th of January, there was an article in the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio explaining what had happened. Here's an excerpt translated from Spanish. An argument with his partner, who was not identified, according to police sources, would have triggered the fatal decision of a scientist specializing in the development of artificial intelligence. The Canadian psychologist and computer scientist Christopher McKinstry, 38. Sources from the prosecutor's office indicated that the body of the professional was found at noon yesterday in his apartment after the person who cleans the place smelled a strong smell of gas, so he called the police. Upon entering the house, the uniformed officers found McKinstry's body lying on the kitchen floor. The Canadian citizen was dressed and had a plastic bag on his head from which a hose came out that was connected to the gas pipe. The persistent inhalation, according to the first investigations, would have caused his death. According to his Chilean partner, who was only said to be 36 years old, last Friday they had a serious argument due to economic and domestic problems, after which McKinstry left his apartment located on Compagnie Street, to which they had moved a few weeks ago, while the one in Merced was for sale. From that day on, she lost contact with him. Chris's death was tragic. Despite his faults, inflated ego, and the likelihood that his actual accomplishments weren't quite as great as he liked everyone to believe, he still had a brilliant mind and so much more potential. He may have had many enemies, but he also had friends, who described him as a smart and nice guy, someone who could make people laugh and wasn't afraid to make a fool of himself in the process. Considering his mental health problems and his previous attempt to leave this world, it sadly wasn't hugely surprising that he actually went through with it this time. But did he? Or could someone else have been involved? Although the El Mercurio article stated that Chris's decision was due to an argument he had with his girlfriend, a Wired article later claimed that none of his friends knew why he had gone through with it this time. In December 2002, a member of the Winnipeg General Group said to Chris, "Hey, weren't you the guy with the suicidal ambitions? Seems you found a way to do this and come out a martyr instead of a coward." Chris replied, "You know what, Ray, there's a lot of truth to what you have said. The idea of suicide was burned out of me in Toronto in 1990, but I can tell you I still feel it. Especially this time of year. I know killing myself will never again be an option, and this seems to be the best thing I can do with the feeling other than deny it. Maybe this is what it was for all along." Of course, a lot can change in 3 years, but at least at this time, Chris seemed fairly sure he didn't see dying as an option anymore, and he hadn't since the gun shop incident 12 years prior. This isn't exactly consistent with his final ever comment about him ODing in 1997, but then again, he didn't explicitly say he planned to actually die this time. The gun shop incident could well have been a cry for help, considering he tried to get help unsuccessfully just a few days prior. His last online interaction indicated that he had OD'd again, and it's entirely possible that when that failed, he decided to try another method. But is it beyond the realm of possibility that this was another cry for help, and that someone else, for some reason, took the opportunity to finalize his attempt? After all, 3 days passed between his final communication online and when his body was found. Did he even OD in the first place? He did post the note to his blog, but strangely, the IP address used to post on the forum was different to the one he normally used. He claimed he was in a cafe at the time, which could explain the different IP address, but if he really planned to die, why would he OD in a public place, surrounded by people who would likely try to save his life? Furthermore, there was another interesting detail in the El Mercurio article, quote, "Prosecutor Lorena Canacre said that although the investigations speak of a suicide, there is still an investigation to be done as to why there was blood near the Canadian's body." This implies that investigators considered the possibility that foul play may have been involved. It's not like there is a reasonable explanation for blood with the supposed cause of death. Could someone have murdered him, then staged the scene to give a different impression? Chris had made many enemies throughout his life, some of whom he reportedly owed a significant amount of money, so it's not like there was no one who could have possibly wanted him dead. Another interesting thing I found is a comment in the Winnipeg General Group from March 1997, in which Chris states that the night before, someone tried very seriously to kill him by shooting at his car. He prefaced that by saying he debated himself on whether to post that as fact or fiction, and decided to just call it fiction for now, because it's easier. He seems to be implying that it did actually happen though, but decided to say it's fiction as some kind of disclaimer or something. I have no idea if he's telling the truth or not. I don't really buy the rest of his story, which is related to someone he met telling him about some military conspiracy. The details aren't really relevant. But who knows if someone really did want him dead? Perhaps that was part of the reason he left Winnipeg not long after. It's honestly hard to say whether there could be more to Chris's death without more information. There doesn't appear to be any other original sources on it anywhere else on the internet. The Wired article I mentioned before also detailed the death of another AI pioneer and rival of Chris's, Singh. Like Chris, Push had always been fascinated by robots and AI, and decided to begin a project called Open Mind Common Sense, which was fundamentally similar to Chris's MindPixel project, in that it was a database of common sense knowledge through open submissions, but where MindPixel had a yes or no questions, OpenMind compiled factual statements. Naturally, the competition between Chris and Push began the second Push announced OpenMind. Those who had already criticised MindPixel were sceptical, to say the least, about OpenMind, with one user questioning, "How is it any less moronic than MindPixel?" Push replied with, "MindPixel isn't moronic, it's courageous. I disagree with how McKinstry is doing it, as a company giving out shares that will never have any value, instead of making it public immediately. And the MindPixel idea of training up a neural network with the database is clearly ridiculous. I also believe our interface is better." Push had misspelled Chris's surname, and Chris responded with, "First, no E in McKinstry, and second, your statement is misleading. The database is publicly available right now, just not for commercial use." He went on to say that if Push thought MindPixel was ridiculous, perhaps he'd be willing to bet on whose database would be the first to achieve intelligence. He acknowledged that OpenMind's interface was better, but pointed out that he had to write MindPixel all by himself. Regardless, he believed MindPixel had one significant advantage. He required his contributor shareholders to verify the accuracy of each other's statements. He implied that OpenMind would end up full of garbage without any form of validation mechanism. Despite the pair's valid criticism of each other's projects, you could say there was healthy competition between them. They seemed to have some level of respect and admiration for each other. Push described Chris as a good guy, and Chris was actually hoping to form a partnership with Push, though this never ended up happening, with Push's collaborator later stating that Chris was fundamentally different than them, and they thought people wouldn't want to participate in a project that was making some guy in Chile rich. MindPixel had launched before OpenMind, and yet it was Chris who seemed more eager to earn Push's approval. As time went on though, this would manifest into what, on the outside, looked like resentment. Push seemingly continued to thrive. OpenMind became part of a common sense computing division at the MIT Media Lab, and he had many other goals to keep him busy, pursuing another research project for his PhD, collaborating with renowned AI experts, speaking at conferences all around the world. Meanwhile, Chris was deteriorating. In addition to his mental health struggles, MindPixel's prospects were dwindling, similar to CR6, threatened by Chris's lack of business skills. He had no commercial partners or applications lined up, and apparently had no intention of honouring any of the promises he'd made to his shareholders. The only advantage it had over OpenMind was that it had significantly more contributions. But what good was that when the project itself had lost direction? Ultimately, MindPixel was discontinued in 2005. It lost its free server in September, and Chris died before he completed his plans to rewrite it as MindPixel 2 that was intended to appear on a new server in France. Just 8 days before Chris announced he had OD'd online, he commented on Push's blog, sounding somewhat bitter. 6 months earlier, Push had finished his dissertation and announced he was now Dr. Singh, and in the same post, spoke of some new ideas his colleague had been developing about how minds grow. Chris disputed that these were new ideas and commented on the post, pointing out that it sounded similar to a 1993 paper that he had provided a link to. On his own blog, he said, "The idea reminded me strongly of some neural network experiments that I replicated in 1997. Push never replied, and regardless, as you know, Chris didn't wait long after this for a reply. On the 28th of January, Bob Mottram, who had turned down an unpaid offer of the position of chief software developer for MindPixel in 2001, but still followed the work of Chris until his death, posted an obituary for Chris on his own blog titled, "Legends in AI, Chris McKinstry." Bob spoke kindly of Chris and implied that his death was a great loss to the potential of AI, stating, quote, "For the present, the last man standing in this game is Push Singh." On the surface, Push was excelling in many ways that Chris had failed, but that's not to say that he wasn't suffering in his personal life. He had seriously injured his back while moving furniture and was in constant pain as a result. At times he wasn't able to do anything because the pain was so bad. On the 28th of February 2006, less than 5 weeks after Chris's death, Push took his own life in an almost identical way. Some wondered if the two men had made some kind of pact, which I personally think is unlikely. I doubt they really had much direct communication at all, particularly in the time running up to their deaths. They were hardly close friends, and there seemed to be no intention of a greater significance of their deaths. It's not like they did it to make a statement. I think it's more plausible that Push was inspired by Chris. Similar to Chris, Push's death is shrouded in mystery too. There's almost no information about it online, and it seems people don't want to talk about it. A number of his colleagues declined to be interviewed for the Wired article, and after Wired began making inquiries, MIT took down the tribute wiki for Push. His childhood friend had this to say about his death. "Sometimes I think this totally ridiculous thought, that he was bumped off like the end of Terminator 2. I wouldn't read too far into this comment, but I did come across a couple of other comments online suggesting that Chris and Push's deaths were linked, and that they might have involved foul play. It does seem a little strange that two men from Canada who were both developing similar, competing projects died in almost exactly the same way less than 5 weeks apart. But ultimately, without more information, it's impossible to say whether or not they were suspicious. Unfortunately, I think it's pretty plausible that both men, for their own reasons, simply didn't want to live anymore. At least that was probably the case for Push, but there's still one more theory we need to consider for Chris's death, and here's where things get really weird. Before we get into the details, it's worth noting that many people considered Chris a con artist. We've covered that already a little regarding CR6. It's hard to determine if it was a genuine attempt at a profitable endeavour, or if it was all just a scam to promote his AI projects and con people out of their money. When it came to MindPixel, Chris failed to keep the promises he'd made to shareholders. Again, I don't know if this was his plan from the start, or if things just didn't go to plan, but it sounds like a number of people also lost money with this project. He was bold enough to ask various people to work for him for free as well, including Bob Mottram, who wrote the obituary mentioned earlier. You can't help but wonder if Chris, while having a genuine interest in progressing AI development, was mostly just out for himself and his own gains, without much consideration for anyone he may have used or deceived to reach his goals. A comment on the Winnipeg General Group summed up some of his other projects that could possibly have been scams. Quote, "Way back in 1995, a fellow named Chris McKinstry posted some astonishing claims to comp.ai Nat Lang regarding a chatbot he'd written called Jackie. He invited people to email him questions to try out on her, so I sent him some, and the replies he claimed she gave set off my hoax alarm. I also debunked Ractor in 1993. He offered to send me the program itself if I'd sign a non-disclosure agreement, but I said I wasn't interested, which for some reason set him off on a vendetta that he's still fighting. In 1996, he launched an audience participation AI project, which I consider 100% bogus, but which has gotten absurd amounts of attention from professionals who should know better. Then in 1997, he made a huge splash with one of the first online soap operas, but it had crashed and burned within 6 months. Persistent rumours, which McKinstry denies, claim he took the money and ran. By 1999, he had landed on his feet in Chile, working in radio astronomy, where he continued to milk the publicity machine with a magical touch, Slashdot interview, etc. I happened to see a BBC article this morning about the Chilean telescope, and got to wondering if he'd self-destructed yet. His personal webpage, Slow Loading, seems to have fallen silent a year ago, so I started doing Goojar searches and soon realised there were so many disconnected fragments of info that I needed to start a timeline to sort them out. My usual strategy with net celebrities is to start with their earliest posts, which in Chris's case went back to 1993. His first 2 years' worth of posts are eye-openers, many shady-sounding business offers. See especially the infrared traffic light controller in December 1944, and absurd boasts, building efficient solar cells in basement, January 1995. In July 1995, Chris claimed he was making holograms, and there are countless other questionable projects. He was quite open about the fact that he smoked weed, took LSD, and smoked Ambisol. I have no idea what that is, unless he actually meant Anbesol, an oral pain relief medication. Perhaps some of these wild claims he made were while under the influence of drugs, when, in the height of grandiose delusion, he was convinced he could actually pull them off. Still, while many smelled BS, he did manage to fool plenty of people with each new idea he had. Anyway, take all that to set the scene of the theory we're about to cover. When I was browsing through the Winnipeg General Group looking for any mention of Chris's death, I was surprised to see that a number of people weren't convinced that he even is dead. Here are a couple of comments. "I'll believe he offed himself only when his skanky corpse ends up back in Canada. There's just too much corruption down there to believe anything that shows up in their media. He was known to have been in the northern US a couple of years ago, so there's some likelihood he was never in Chile to begin with." I don't remember the exact date, but it isn't recent. It was a minor story in one of the papers at the time. There was a rumour about him faking his death in order to get away from his past. From what I remember of him, and from what the local police who worked with him had to say, it's a possibility. In response to the comment, "I do know the man committed suicide." Bullshit. All you know is there was a report on the internet that he supposedly died from suicide, and that's a long way from being either factual evidence or proof of anything. He was a con artist whose only talent lie in being a con artist. That doesn't make him bright, it just makes him a career con artist. There only appears to be one source that ever reported Chris's death, the article I quoted earlier in the video. Chris's Wikipedia and the few other references all cite this one article as a source. It's a little odd. Chris wasn't exactly an A-list celebrity, but he wasn't a nobody. You'd expect there to be more reports. Anyway, let's go back to CR6 for a while. I mentioned before that there was a group of people on Discord who were searching for CR6. I don't know if the server is still active, but I couldn't find a working invite link anywhere, so I haven't been able to access it. Blame It On Jorge actually covered CR6 in a video a couple of years ago, and he interviewed someone from the Discord group known as Network Opera, we'll call him Opera, who revealed some very interesting and mysterious information. I'd recommend checking out that video if you want to hear the interview itself, but I'll summarize it now. After reaching out to a couple of people who didn't end up providing any new information, a person with the username HeavyEarly69, we'll call him Heavy, joined the server. Opera asked if he came from Reddit. He replied, "Sort of. I'll just observe for a while before participating." Sounds like Heavy was just a random person who wanted to catch up to speed before joining the search, or someone who had insider knowledge wanting to suss the vibe before revealing anything. A few hours later, Heavy sent a photo in the chat of what appeared to be a newspaper ad for CR6. This instantly piqued Opera's interest. After countless hours of scouring the internet, every archive they could find, they hadn't yet come across this image. So we reverse image searched it and 0 matches. Opera asked Heavy, "Who are you?" and was met with the vague reply, "Someone who was there." He went on to say, quote, "I have to know why you're all so interested. The internet was in its infancy. There were no Facebooks or Twitters. It was the Wild West. It was a cult of personality. It was all about Chris." This was all very strange to Opera, who understood why Heavy would want anonymity, but it seemed like more than that. It seemed like Heavy did not want anyone looking into this. Opera explained that although they heard CR6 turned out to be a disaster, they were all interested because it was still accidentally historic. Heavy responded, perhaps somewhat dismissively, with words to the effect of that it was just all about Chris, no one got paid, it was all a sham. Opera then directly asked him, "You worked on CR6?" He replied, "I don't think I should say anything else." And that was it. He ghosted them and was never heard from again. After this, Opera contacted a woman on Facebook whose name wasn't revealed in Blame It On Jorge's video, so let's call her Mary. He got a reply from someone claiming to be her assistant, but it soon became clear to him that he was not talking to her assistant, but likely Mary herself. He thinks she mentioned an assistant, so she didn't have to say any specific details about it, and he's probably right, but it's honestly bizarre. What could she possibly be so apprehensive to speak about? Opera explained that they were trying to find out more because people seemed so elusive about CR6 and don't want to remember it at all. She said that the biggest part in that is that Chris didn't pay anyone. I can't be the only one that doesn't buy that at all. I can imagine it would be extremely frustrating to be deceived into wasting your time and effort on a project only to receive none of the payment you were promised. But why would that prevent you from even talking about it 25 years later? I don't even blame people for still being a bit bitter about it, but I'm so sure there's more to it than them not being paid. I even wondered if Chris had these individuals sign an NDA to prevent them talking about it, but he's been dead for 18 years at that point. Unless he hasn't, of course. Either way, the secrecy and lack of cooperation from multiple people seems to hint at something deeper and darker. Anyway, Opera admitted that he messed up when he said to Mary that he wouldn't be surprised if CR6 turned out bad, because why would anyone even want to try if they're not being paid? Mary got defensive and said the creative team all went on to become highly successful in their fields. She was very protective of them and wouldn't want them to be criticised in any shape or form. This was further confirmation for Opera that he was speaking to Mary herself and not her assistant. Why would an assistant go to such great lengths to defend work she wasn't even responsible for? But also, I wonder why Mary herself would go to such great lengths to defend them. After seeing some interactions online between other crew members, I didn't get the vibe that they were all close friends or anything. Sure, make the point that your colleagues from 25 years ago did their best and were not useless at their jobs, but why get personally offended? After this, Mary's supposed assistant sent one final message, along the lines of, "Thanks for your curiosity, but honestly I've said too much. Hopefully Mary will come back in a couple of days to clear things up." And lo and behold, neither Mary nor her assistant ever contacted Opera again. So that's two people who were somehow involved in the production of CR6 who clearly didn't want to talk about it much. Both said they'd said too much already, before disappearing, never to be heard from again. Despite attempts to track down the cast, none of them have been contacted. As Blame It on Jorge put it, most of them are random, no-named people with zero trace of them left online. Perhaps the only hope of recovering CR6 would be to locate the cast, considering Chris claimed to have sold the rights to trademarks, story, characters, and production software to the cast for $1 in June 1997. Who knows if that's even true though? Anita Dittmar, who mentioned starring in CR6 in her blog, never said anything about owning the rights to the show, and you'd think that would be something worth mentioning. All she said is that she had the CNN segment on VHS, so it's safe to assume that she wasn't in possession of any part of CR6 itself. I tried contacting 4 people involved with CR6 on Facebook. At least 3 of them are pretty active, and 2 have posted publicly since my messages, but none of them responded. It's safe to say that the search for CR6 has hit a wall, and I can't say I have much hope it'll ever be found. As for the strange interactions from people that were successfully contacted, I really don't know what to make of it. Contrast their reactions with Ian McCausland's and it's even more baffling. He wasn't able to provide much new information, but he certainly seemed much more open than others, and even went out of his way to attempt to find others who were a part of CR6. It makes me wonder if something happened between Chris and some of the other cast members that Ian had no knowledge of. I keep thinking back on that comment on his Facebook post from the woman who claimed that Chris had conned her into being a co-executive producer instead of an actor. I worked with him at his house until it became frightening. What could she have meant by this? It sounds much more serious than her not being paid for her work. When browsing the Winnipeg General Google group, I came across a few comments that indicated that there might be a different side to Chris. We already know that he likely scammed a lot of people out of money, that he was regarded by many as narcissistic, provocative, bitter. One thing I don't think I mentioned yet is that he apparently abandoned his wife, who he openly admitted to cheating on, and son in Canada when he fled to Chile, leaving them in debt that was likely caused by him, so you could add selfish to that list also. We know he struggled with his mental health for most of his adult life, but until I extensively trolled through the Winnipeg General group, I didn't realise he was ever a danger to anyone but himself. So imagine my surprise when I came across multiple comments claiming that he had pistol whipped his ex-girlfriend when he lived in Canada. Chris vehemently denied these claims, and without a reputable source to back them up, bearing in mind that he was a very disliked individual, and we all know how baseless rumours can spread within a community, I wasn't 100% convinced, until I watched the documentary, The Man Behind the Curtain. This documentary covers Chris's work related to AI while delving into his troubled mind, and ultimately his death. One of his friends mentioned that he had a bunch of relationships and most of them didn't end very well. Then one of his ex-girlfriends, Diana, described her relationship with him. Shortly after she met him, she was hospitalized and diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and she said she was worried that no one was going to look at her, but Chris did look at her, and he cared about her, and he liked her anyway. He told her this is just a stage and that she'd pass through it and be fine, and that he'd be there for her. When their relationship began, everything was perfect. They were both so in love, but soon Diana saw a different side to him. Quote, "He had two sides. Today I love you, and tomorrow I hate you with all my guts. He became something crazy and aggressive. Aggressive against other people, and aggressive about himself. We just had to move, and he didn't want to help me, so it was me alone. I couldn't move my hand or feet. Moving the whole place to the other apartment. I felt very lonely. I called my friend and I told him I need the guys to help me carry the things. He was upset because of the people that helped me, that I was cheating on him because I asked for help. It was so crazy. And so he grabbed his hammer and he started hitting mannequins. I had to give away two because he broke them. I was so scared. I thought he was going to hammer my head." So my interpretation of this is that Chris love-bombed a vulnerable woman at her most vulnerable time, and when he had gained her trust, showed his violent side, causing her to fear for her life. Is it really that unbelievable that he pistol-whipped another of his ex-girlfriends? The woman who commented on Ian's Facebook post said that when she worked with Chris at his house, it eventually became frightening. The person who Oprah spoke to on Facebook, who seemed reserved and in the end worried she'd said too much, was also a woman. Oprah referred to Heavy Early 69, who joined the Discord group and also ghosted after saying they said too much, was a man, but from what I saw, they didn't actually say anything that would imply or confirm that they were a man, so it's possible they too were a woman. Either way, I'm noticing a pattern here. And it's potentially starting to make sense why Ian seemed to have no qualms speaking openly about the show, why the other male individual contacted by Oprah only really said that he didn't want to restart the hate on Chris, because they had no negative experiences with him, but it seems the same can't be said for at least two of the women. To be clear, I'm not implying that Ian or the other man were covering for Chris. I don't know that they weren't, but I don't have any reason to believe they were. It's entirely possible that some of the women involved with CR6 saw a different side to Chris, a side that perhaps the men weren't aware of, and it terrified them. But why would they still be this terrified 25 years later, 18 years after Chris died? Was whatever happened so traumatic that it still haunts them to this day? Or do they not believe that Chris is long gone and no longer able to harm them? Did the other unidentified man really not want Chris to be hated in death? Or did he not want to encourage harassment of a man who's still very much alive? A few days after Oprah's conversation with Mary, another person, Dustin, who was clearly involved with CR6, joined the Discord server and replied to the screenshot of the email from the unidentified man. Quote, "Honestly, I've got to agree with him. As far as Chris's legacy goes, yes, he was bullied online, but he was also abusive himself. He treated people poorly, conned them, didn't pay them, and tried to pit them against each other, at times successfully. So if you approach people who worked on the show with, "We're trying to restore McKinstry's legacy," you're probably going to get some pushback. Just my 2 cents. Yes, he was mentally ill, but he was also a brilliant con man who knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he didn't lose money, and he knew he'd cheated the creative team out of $69,000. He also owed money to the Mariagi Hotel, the limo company, the Pyramid Cabaret, the company that provided the spotlights for the launch, Brown Communications, Jaguar, etc. He paid no one. Brown Communications was the company that produced the CR6 promotional video. Dustin went on to say that Chris would harbour after young, aspiring actors or models, people that were trying to get famous, and convince them that the show was going to be a huge deal, so if they signed on at the ground level, they'd get big with the show, because it was the first ever web series in internet history. Technically it wasn't, though you could argue it was at least supposed to be a step up from the couple of series that already existed. Not that it mattered. I get the vibe that the truth wasn't really important for Chris, as long as he could convince people he was telling the truth. Anyway, Dustin's next message was even more intriguing. I heard Brown Communications had an aggressive collection agency after him, and that McKinstry faked his own death to escape his creditors. Whether that's true or not, who knows, but is he capable of doing something like that? Without a doubt. So here we have another person who believes it's possible that Chris faked his own death, and this time it's someone who actually worked alongside him. Now you might be thinking this is just a bunch of conspiracy theorists placing too much weight in local hearsay and letting their minds run wild. But bear in mind, there's usually no smoke without fire, and rest assured, there are still a few twists left in this bizarre story. When Oprah asked Dustin if there's any evidence for this, he replied, "Whenever anyone tries to correct his Wikipedia entry to add that he conned a lot of people, it always quickly reverts back to the original." When Oprah checked the edit history of Chris's Wikipedia page, he noticed another line that was being disputed, quote, "As of the 27th of February 2006, his family has not claimed his body. As of the 11th of April 2006, rumours of the family doing the necessary paperwork or those of his body returning to Canada haven't been verified." Remember that Chris supposedly died in Santiago, Chile, where he had lived for many years, and as far as I'm aware, all of his family still lived in Canada. There was a source for the part about Chris's family not claiming his body, but that source is now a dead link. Anyway, the line I quoted was repeatedly removed by one IP address, leaving comments insisting his body was claimed, but without providing a source for that information. When that IP address was run through an IP tracer, it was determined to be located in Santiago, Chile. As you've probably gathered by now, Chris was a frequent poster in the Winnipeg General Google group. Even years after he fled Canada and moved to Chile, there was something that always brought him back to the group dedicated to his hometown. Although it seemed that most people he interacted with on there felt at least mild contempt for him, perhaps he viewed it as his pipeline to home. He had an attachment to it. So much so that he continued posting there even after his death. Less than a month after Chris supposedly died, he, or someone pretending to be him, made various comments on the Winnipeg group. Here's an example. The purple text is what he's replying to. "I don't know who Chris McKinstry was, nor do I care who he was. I was, nay, am, the most brilliant person to emerge from the cesspool you call home. I was a millionaire many times over while you were still suckling your mother's breasts. I've invented various forms of copy protection software, the world's largest AI project, and an ahead of its time online soap opera. I could show you things you've never seen. I am K. Christopher McKinstry. I do know the man committed suicide. It wasn't hard, a bag over the head tied to the gas line. The seventh dimension greeted me with open arms. By the sounds of things, he was a bright guy who must have upset a lot of posters by making them think. All of the internet's users are brain dead. I am the only shining light in this sea of dim. My point is to shed light on other posters' petty and almost gleeful responses and reactions to McKinstry's death. They mock me, but I have the final laugh. I am now in the 7-dimensional mind-space continuum. I am everywhere. I am everything. Mocking the dead is bad karma and reeks of extremely low character. Is the insatiable appetite for childish ad hominem attacks so rabid it must now be directed at the dead as well as the living? McKinstry is not around to defend himself, is he? Do you not understand kicking a man while he is down is the act of a true coward? Karma is a human invention. Here in the 7th dimension, there is only the awesome power of my mind, and it is good. Wallow in your filth, eat your fast food, reproduce with your fetid women. I am in a better place. I am K. Christopher McKinstry. Stop acting like mental munchkins prancing around clucking "the witch is dead." Why does my ascension into a superhuman energy form bother you, sir? The 7th dimensions of the mind-space continuum are awe-inspiring. Grow up and let this guy rest. When you're lying in bed tonight, I'll be watching you from the dark corner of your room, TC. You intrigue me. Yours from the 7th dimension, K. Christopher McKinstry, draw B21, Morgue, General Hospital, Santiago, Chile. Around a month after this, another comment read, "It's been 2 long months that I've been in this cramped refrigerated drawer. I'm starting to smell, and various juices from my decomposition are starting to pool around my back. My skin is completely detached and is loose like a cat's. My connective tissues are degrading. I'm sure my arms would come off with a good tug. Please convince the authorities to send me back to Winnipeg COD. I want to be buried near the good people of Winnipeg General. The 7-dimensional space mind continuum is amazing. You should free yourself from your meat husks and join me. From the past, present, and future, K. Christopher McKinstry, draw B21, Morgue, General Hospital, Santiago, Chile." The talk of the 7th dimension seems to be a reference to one of the comments left on his final post before his death. Given the trolling he experienced in life, it's certainly possible that someone decided to troll him in death by pretending to be him. But if Chris did fake his own death, I wouldn't put it past him to continue posting online. He'd probably have gotten a kick out of it. Either way, these posts are incredibly eerie to read. What's interesting is that Chris often told his friends that he intended to upload his consciousness into a machine. He wrote various ramblings in notebooks, speaking about immortality, seemingly theorizing that he would have to choose to die to achieve that. Perhaps that could have been part of his reason behind dying, if he did die. If he didn't, maybe he posted online after to make it look like he had become immortal. If the technology to upload consciousness to a machine will ever even be possible, it certainly wasn't available in 2006, and Chris knew that, so maybe the next best thing would be for him to fake his death and convince people he'd found a way. Let's not forget that he might well have had legit serious reasons to fake his death. He made a lot of enemies, owed a lot of people a lot of money, apparently had an aggressive collection agency after him. There was also talk of him being wanted in Canada for not paying taxes, so I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't pay taxes in Chile as well. He openly admitted to sleeping around while married. Who's to say he didn't have an affair with a married woman? Her husband found out and came after Chris. I believe his ex-girlfriend's claims that he smashed up her place with a hammer. What if he went on to physically attack another woman, and the consequences of that might have put his life at risk? Then there was the comment he made in 1997, claiming that someone tried to kill him. I don't know if I believe that, but it doesn't really matter if it's true or not. What matters is if Chris believed it. He had a history of drug abuse and mental illness. Those combined, plus the very real possibility that people were actually after him, might have got him to a point where he was convinced his only option left was to fake his death, or he'd be dead for real. As for whether it's plausible that he could have pulled this off, Dustin and others who knew him certainly seem to think so. Honestly, I don't really know much about Chile, so take this with a pinch of salt. But I did come across various comments online from people claiming to live in Chile, talking about how there's a lot of corruption and how it's not beyond the realm of possibility that with money and a couple of connections, you could fake your death, especially nearly 20 years ago. The information we've covered so far is a little suspicious, but I haven't yet mentioned the most damning evidence. There is literally no death certificate for Chris. The Discord search party had tried looking for a death certificate or police report before and found nothing, but with them not being from Chile, they didn't know if such documents would be public anyway. Right before Blame It On Jorge uploaded his video, another YouTube named Celion also made a video on CR6. This introduced many Chilean Spanish-speaking people to the mystery who had a much better chance at finding a death record, and still, nothing. Opera was directed to a database of death certificates, and when he searched Chris's name, he was met with a message that translated to, "Dear user, the data entered do not meet the requirements to issue this certificate." So basically, there was no death certificate. And in case you're wondering if there was some error entering his details, or perhaps there's no certificate because he was originally from Canada, this Reddit comment explains how that can't be the case. Quote, "Since he lived for longer than 5 years in Chile, he had the right to vote and was in the voter register, which by law must be published sometime before every election, so of course it's been made available online and monetized. You can look him up here and find his RUN, national ID number. Just enter McKinstry and it'll show him and his son's info as well. Then you can go to the Civil Registry Services website, where you can get, for free in seconds, death certificates among other documents if you know the person's RUN. After you enter the RUN, it will display a form for you to enter your own information. You have to use a desktop browser. On mobile, you have to enter the person's and your own info in one step. If you enter McKinstry's RUN, it doesn't take you to the second step, and instead it returns the message, "Dear user, the data entered do not meet the requisites to issue this certificate." It's the same message that you get if you enter a living person's RUN, and it's not the same message you get if you enter an invalid RUN. I also tried with some famous foreigners who died in Chile I could think of, and who show up in the voter register, and didn't get the error message, meaning the death certificate is available. So I don't think being a foreigner explains the message, so let the conspiracy theories roll. So it seems that the only reason this message would appear on the registry site is that Chris is still alive. As I said before, there appeared to be only one single report of Chris's death in the first place, in the El Mercurio newspaper and website. That link is now dead, and the page exists only on Wayback Machine as an archive. There is conflicting information on what happened to his body, and seemingly no credible sources to verify. The Wikipedia page on Chris stated that his body wasn't claimed, but this line was repeatedly moved by the IP address from Santiago, where Chris lived, and there appears to be no sources to verify that it was or wasn't claimed. The Wired article stated that Chris was cremated, and his remains are said to be under his son's bed in the UK. But again, there was no source for this, and it's worded more like hearsay than actual facts. Chris posted a photo of him and his son on Flickr in December 2004, and his son looks very young, maybe around 3 years old, so I'm guessing he was around 4 or 5 when Chris died. It seems a little strange that a 4 or 5-year-old child would have his dad's ashes under his bed. I'm not sure I believe that. No one has found a gravestone or memorial. The only obituary for Chris was written by Bob Mottman, and it doesn't sound like they knew each other on a personal level. Ultimately, there is no verifiable evidence that Chris died in January 2006. While I'm not 100% convinced that Chris did fake his own death, I do think it is a possibility. He could well have died since, but there's a decent amount of information to suggest that it might not have been in 2006. It is worth noting that apart from the comments on the Winnipeg General group, which haven't been confirmed to be Chris, no one has found any posts from him elsewhere online since. In the documentary, The Man Behind the Curtain, a man named Pedro, who was Chris's friend and colleague, described how he'd heard about Chris's last online interaction and rushed to his home to check on him. When he arrived, a police officer was there, who said the man in the apartment was dead. Pedro entered the apartment and saw Chris's body with a bag over his head. Of course, you could argue that Pedro knew about Chris's faked death and that he concocted this tale to make it seem more believable, or that he saw someone else's body. He did have a bag over his head after all, so Pedro never saw his face. It sounds a bit of a stretch, but I guess you never know. Another thing worth noting though is that the El Mercurio article stated that when Chris's body was found, he was fully clothed, whereas Pedro claimed that Chris was naked with only a bag over his head. This is quite a significant discrepancy and I'm not quite sure what to make of it. I'll let you make your own mind up on it anyway. It's kinda crazy to think this all started out as a search for one of the first web series that had been all but forgotten. Who knew its creator would turn out to be such a complex and enigmatic character? The most recent comment on the Lost Media Wiki is this. This search is dead. I'm a lurker in Lost Media cases and somewhat active in the server of the CR6 search. I'm trying on my free time to archive on my own what was found on the server, but the server itself is not the best place to keep a search like this. It doesn't really matter, however. I'm doing so the search itself doesn't become lost media, but CR6 is at a stump. Without any new leads, reasonably the only people that would still have a copy of any episode do not and should not be contacted. Those being people that were already contacted and made clear that they don't want to be involved, or family and friends that have nothing to do with CR6. A big problem with the search is Chris himself. Much of the allure of this search is not the show, but if Chris did or not himself, what did he do, who he was, and realistically this has nothing to do with the search itself. We have had people that talked to him in forums come up, people that interacted with him, but all they could offer, if I remember correctly, had to do with Chris and not CR6. If this search comes back, and don't get me wrong, as pessimistic as this comment sounds, I do want this to be partially or entirely found. It needs to have a focus on CR6 itself and not Chris, which is hard. There is an allure about Chris that CR6 itself doesn't have, and an abundance of information left by the man itself and the people that knew him. The commenter is right. CR6 is an interesting rabbit hole in itself, but it's overshadowed by the mystery of Chris. And you can't really talk about how CR6 failed without getting into the controversy that eventually leads to the theory that Chris faked his own death. It all seems so intertwined, especially considering that people who worked on CR6 still don't want to talk about it, nearly 3 decades later. It actually took me around a month on and off to research all this and write this script. I don't think I've ever spent so long on a video, but I found every bit of it so fascinating. Chris said that CR6 would hold people for decades, and it kind of did, just not in the way he expected. I'll end the video with this comment that I found on Blame It On Jorge's video. It almost seems to me that this is the show. A cast and crew who seem to repeat the same lines, be ambiguous about the same things, a creator who said he thinks this could go on for decades, old cast and crew who leave what are ultimately breadcrumbs for a show that's just photos. All it would take is someone to have the foresight for what the internet would become or might become. Honestly, jokes about this stuff weren't uncommon. We should blank. Maybe someone will find it in 20 or 200 years. Pondering what future internet archaeology might be like. There's probably lots of stuff stoned people did offhand with that idea in their heads. The possibility of this being something like that isn't absolutely unfathomable. Perhaps everyone forgot about it, and now that people are interested, they're just playing their roles and saying their lines. It is oddly defined as a soap opera with mystical elements, death, rebirth, ambiguous states in between. Projected to last for decades, right? Sounds like the narratives coming out are ripe for that. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments, plus any suggestions you might have for a future video. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time in a new video.